Welcome back to Menopause Mastery. What if I were to tell you today that I've been right all along and that cortisol, your stress chemistry, is potentially a cause for weight gain, weight loss resistance, sleep issues, hypertension, cardiovascular risk, diabetes, sleep apnea, and the list goes on and on. What I'm going to do today is actually cover not only some information from a study called the Catalyst study, but also some information that was shared last week in my office about a new medication that actually can block the cortisol receptors. And this is very much a game changer, mostly because of what we found in the study, because it really proved what I've been screaming for the last 20 years, that our diagnostic criteria for high cortisol in an endocrinology disorder was too narrow, and that it was missing a large swath of people that were exhibiting disease states where cortisol was at cause. So I feel vindicated. Thank you very much. But I also want you to understand it so you can then navigate your own health. So, what's the biggest picture? What's the big picture you need to understand about cortisol, especially for women? Is cortisol could be the hidden culprit and or cause behind weight gain, and particularly weight gain that won't budge. What if it's fueling potentially high blood pressure, high cholesterol, metabolic dysfunction like type 2 diabetes risk, and weight gain around the middle, and even type 2 diabetes? What if it is actually causing sleep apnea and other disorders that actually shorten our life, or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or otherwise known as NASH? What if our current medical model for diagnosing cortisol related disorders is too narrow and actually missing many women? And guess what? It's nearly 30% who are actually suffering from a cortisol imbalance. So, what exactly is the latest research? What is it showing? It's time to bring it to light. So, I want you to kind of grab some tea, coffee, whatever you got to do to listen to this. Hopefully, it's not too much coffee because it raises your cortisol. And let's dive into this complex topic and really get into it. So, let's start with some basics just to get it out of the way for everybody. What is cortisol? So cortisol is produced by the adrenal glands. It's a little tiny thumbnail sized gland that sits on top of your kidneys. And we've got two of them. And it's part of your body's fight or flight response. And it is actually what rushes in behind fight or flight and allows you to respond to stress ongoing. Fight or flight is actually adrenaline, or otherwise known as catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine, primarily norepinephrine and epinephrine. And then cortisol comes in behind, and its job is to sort of buffer that initial response and then continue to respond to the stressors. Now, this has a whole cascade of metabolic effects. It increases blood sugar for immediate energy. So it's pulling blood sugar out of glycogen stores, out of the liver stores, and dumping it into the bloodstream so you can run or fight. And it's also increasing blood pressure by changing hormones like aldosterone and renin, angiotensin 1 and 2, that actually constrict your blood vessels and increase blood pressure again, so you can keep that heart rate up and keep going. And it also suppresses things like, digestion, reproduction, which would be your sex hormones. It's going to suppress other hormones that are there that are considered a luxury under a stress response. So, in a healthy system, a healthy body system, when the threat's gone, your cortisol levels should return to normal. But what happens if they don't? Right? So, chronic stress, whether it's physical or emotional, physical could be an illness, a inflammatory condition, a very low calorie diet, or very, very poor macronutrient related diet where you're not getting all the nutrients you need, can actually raise your cortisol. But often it can also be emotional, right? Work stress, life stress, stress overall, but even depression, anxiety has a cortisol component to it. And when it remains elevated for long periods of time, that's where things start to break down. Now, when it's chronically high, obviously it's going to raise your blood sugar, so it raises insulin, making you more insulin resistant. What happens when we become more insulin resistant? We are actually going to store more body fat, especially visceral fat around the middle. Particularly cortisol, blood sugar, insulin, body fat being inflammatory all come together with this really nasty side effect of an increase of visceral fat. So, for instance, we have Addison's disease, which is the inability to produce cortisol. We have Cushing's disease on the other extreme end of that. One of the things that we see where cortisol is high in the case of Cushing's is often significant weight gain around the middle and even the kind of buffalo hump sort of fat that you see kind of on the back of the neck. But usually the arms and legs get much skinnier or stay thinner than the abdomen. So that excess cortisol sets up for visceral fat, that fat underneath the muscle tissue. When it's chronically high, we also see increased inflammatory response. So, even though cortisol, oddly enough, in the short term can be sort of anti inflammatory, long term, the metabolic downstream effects of having high cortisol actually is going to keep you producing more and more inflammation, which then sets the stage for higher blood pressure, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, high lipids, which is your cholesterol, and it even messes with your sleep, leading to things like insomnia and sleep apnea. Now, here's the kicker. Even though these symptoms are so common in women, particularly as we go through menopause, the endocrinology world tends to look at these symptoms through these very, very narrow diagnostic criteria, particularly in the case of Cushing's, which is a rare disorder where there is usually an adrenal benign tumor that is overproducing cortisol. Now, sometimes it can be a pituitary problem where it's overproducing the signal ACTH to tell the adrenals to make excess cortisol, but often it's a benign little tumor that just sort of runs amok. So in Cushing syndrome, we see this rapid escalation or significant escalation of cortisol, but they were sky high. Right now, the problem is the requirements. So the drugs that are used to test this is a thing called dexamethasone, right? And we do a dexamethasone challenge, which you take the drug about midnight or 11 o'clock the night before, and then you test the early morning cortisol and you look for the appropriate response. So when it doesn't respond appropriately, that can be a sign of excess cortisol. Now, the diagnostic criteria for Cushing's is so narrow that the vast majority of people fell out. But in this study, they actually redefined the criteria and moved the criteria down a little bit for all the people that had high overall output of cortisol in excessive amounts, way above what we would see in the ideal range, right? So this was a groundbreaking study called the Catalyst study, and it's really helping us understand the true scope of cortisol-related disorders and getting a much greater understanding of it. So the Catalyst study involved 1,000 patients with difficult to control diabetes, high blood pressure, and the majority of them were significantly overweight. Now, they were testing for hypercortisolism, which is a dexamethasone suppression test. It's a common way to see if it's active because it should suppress it, and when it doesn't, we know that something's going on. And so here are some of the key findings. Right? And this is a link between cortisol, obesity, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes. Okay, so the prevalence of hypercortisolism and obesity and difficult to control type 2 diabetes was 24% of the 1,000 that they looked at. So 24% of the patients that they looked at, they could directly correlate the excess cortisol to the type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular risk. And these are patients that were taking medications, but they couldn't get control of the medications. They couldn't get really good control of the A1C. And it's because of that interaction effect between cortisol, insulin, and blood sugar. Among the patients with both type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, which is arterial plaquing, hypertension, high lipids, are all going to drive that. Now it was even higher. So hypercortisolism was even higher at 33.3%. So what this tells us in patients with cardiovascular risk, especially if they have multiple that have significant stress, we need to probably take a big look at what's going on with their cortisol and go a little deeper than just getting a fasting serum cortisol or even, sorry, everybody, a salivary cortisol or a 24-hour urine. We'll see some of those things, but we need a dexamethasone suppression test to really see it. Now, in patients with difficult to control hypertension, high blood pressures, especially people that were stacking meds. So many people with high blood pressure will often get into this game where they're stacking 3 and 4 meds, or 2 or 3, trying to hit all those different aldosterone, renin, angiotensin 1 and 2, beta blockers. Well, they found that hypercortisolism was present in 40% of the cases. All right, so those are astronomical numbers. Astronomical numbers, because what it tells you is that cortisol was the root cause of the condition, not secondary to it. It was causal for it. Now, how does this happen, right? So, when we have chronically high levels, again, we have reduced insulin sensitivity, higher levels of blood sugar, we have higher levels of gluconeogenesis at the liver, which is your liver producing glucose out of your amino acids, which are proteins, right? So you could be eating a good diet and still have this, right? So it's going to increase fat accumulation, visceral fat, reduce muscle mass. Well, when this is happening, so one of the things that was found in Cushing's and is found in these individuals too, is they start losing muscle mass because cortisol being high is catabolic. Catabolic means you're going to chew up muscle mass. So you could be doing your protein and stuff, but you may be losing muscle mass anyway because your body is using protein as a fuel to make more glucose to respond to the stressor. Now, we're also going to see cravings for sugar and fat at the same time. So, like a donut's going to be pretty enticing because it's high in fat and high in sugar, because cortisol drives that sort of dietary desire because we need fast, ready to use fuel. And guess what else we see? When you have high metabolized cortisol, right? We can test this in urine tests, particularly 24-hour urine is the best place to see this. But you can see high metabolized cortisol is going to also reduce thyroid function. It downregulates thyroid function by blocking the receptor for thyroid, and you'll see a downregulation of your T3 conversion on top of it. So this means that traditional weight loss strategies like, oh, I'm sorry, trainers and everybody online, calorie reduction and exercise will often fail these individuals because they cannot control the metabolic effect behind the scenes. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh my God, I see my trainer twice a week and I work out 5 days a week and I'm under stress and I'm carrying weight around the middle and I have a hard time sleeping, I have insomnia, my cholesterol level's going up, my blood pressure's going up, maybe you're having abnormal blood sugar, you may very well be one of these individuals that are being overlooked by standard endocrinology requirements for diagnosis. Now, like I said, in the Catalyst study, the people with high cortisolemia also had significantly higher rates of coronary artery disease, so like 16.7% compared to the patients who were not high, and they had 9.8. AFib was 6.7 compared to 1.4. Heart failure, 8.3 to 3%. So what we see is when cortisol is high, it raises blood pressure through multiple mechanisms. It increases vascular resistance, so the resistance of the fluid running through there. It increases sensitivity to catecholamines, right? So adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, we get a faster angiotensin response. So we have a faster narrowing of the arteries to increase pressure. And we get sodium and water retention, and we get fluid overload. And so we get swelling, and we also get, if somebody's got heart conditions, they may see more concerns with CHF because of fluid imbalances. And then fluid in the interstitial spaces between the cell membranes. And we get just fluid retention in that third compartment, which is also bad, right? So if any of this is sounding like this to you, this is really, really important. Now, we also found in the Catalyst study, in another study called the Monarch study, called MASH and NASH, is currently investigating, so it's underway right now, cortisol targeting medications, which is the drug we were actually exploring, how it may improve liver function in patients with metabolic disordered fat storage in their liver, so NASH, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So cortisol increases the availability of free fatty acids, contributing to fat accumulation and the progression of metabolically deranged fat storage in the liver, or MASH. Now, free fatty acids, people often go, well, isn't that good? Because then I have free fatty acids and I can burn them. No, it's not good. They don't get burned because in order for them to get burned, you need insulin to come down. So if I have a ton of free fatty acids in my serum and I've got glucose and I've got insulin, I have basically pulled up to a gas station with my car, and instead of putting regular or diesel in my engine, I've just got both spigots of the gas pump pouring out into the street, which would be my blood supply, and my car can't get it. It's the hallmark of metabolic disorders and type 2 diabetes, and it basically leads to fat accumulation in the liver, metabolic disorder, weight gain around the middle, and then the list goes on and on. And actually, in this study, the Monarch study, they showed that the medication lowered liver fat, so fatty liver, by 28.2% and improved liver enzymes, ALT and AST. So, fatty liver, how many people have been told that? Or actually, let me restate this. How many people have this and have no idea because they've never had a sonogram? But if you have weight gain around the middle, if you are, over 35 inches for a female, over 40 for a male, it is likely that you're starting to develop fat in the liver. And that makes the liver congested and less able to do its job over time. And that's problematic, right? For many, many reasons. Ladies, if you're noticing more fine lines and wrinkles, it's not just about aging, it's about the loss of estrogen. And that affects our skin structure, making it drier, thinner, less firm. But here's the great news: I've created Biased Mastery Cream to help. This luxurious bioidentical estrogen cream supports your natural hydration and elasticity. It's packed with nourishing oils like olive, jojoba, aloe, and coconut, so it feels amazing and helps soften those lines and bring back that healthy glow. I've been using it, and let me tell you, my skin has never looked or felt better. It's smoother, more radiant, and those little cracks and creases are way less noticeable. If you're ready to give your skin some extra love, check out Biased Mastery on the Metabolic Blueprint website. And that's metabolicblueprint.com/Biased Mastery. That's BIEST Mastery, Mastery. And your face will thank you. Now, cortisol disrupts sleep. It causes insomnia, so not only trouble falling asleep, but it's staying asleep. It also increases the risk of obstructive sleep apnea by further relaxing the airway muscles. So, if you've listened to my conversation about progesterone, you know that progesterone relaxes the airway muscles more, so we're more likely to have upper airway resistance and/or sleep apnea. Well, cortisol does that too. So, if you're stressed out and have crappy progesterone, now we've got more. Right? There's a lot going on here. And then cortisol levels are going to be higher if we're sleep deprived. And so we have this sort of vicious cycle that keeps going and going and going. Yeah. So what does this all tell us, right? So cortisolism is common in patients that are overweight and struggling. Patients maybe with metabolic syndrome, which is sort of the hallmarks of prediabetes and cardiovascular risk, and particularly people with type 2 diabetes. It's independently linked, I would say causal, to weight gain, poor glycemic control, treatment-resistant hypertension, and increases your cardiovascular disease risk, which is the number one killer of all women, and increases disease progression with liver disease and other things. Now, here's where it gets really interesting: is the traditional treatments we use for these secondary comorbidities, right? Type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, fail and often don't work well because they're not addressing the root cause of the excess cortisol. So you could be throwing a bunch of meds on top and it's not doing anything. Now, here's the problem: is endocrinology has a narrow and inappropriate definition, and even within that definition of Cushing's disease, they often miss people who have it but have fluctuating symptoms. So what we know is that dexamethasone suppression test needs to be at like 1.4, not at the much higher level expected that is usually used for Cushing's. So what this really means is that it's probably driving resistance to many, many treatments, and it's also leading to you not losing weight when you're trying. Here's where it makes it even more interesting. So they have also looked, it's not published, but I'm giving you a little bit of insight here, to people who are also failing the, holy grail of weight loss right now, which is your GIP and GLP drugs. So Ozempic, Wegovy, tirzepatide, Mounjaro, right? So semaglutide. So if somebody's taking those meds and not getting any result, there could be multiple reasons. One of them is it could very well be that you're missing estrogen and progesterone, which I'm going to talk about. Number two, it may very well be that you are getting a metabolic effect and a brain effect of those drugs, but the cortisol problem behind it is your primary root cause. And until you fix that, you won't be able to actually get it under control, because you are fighting a losing battle, because cortisol does so much to affect the metabolism of the human body. And so that's why it makes it so hard to lose weight. So it's a really interesting foray into, our quick fix sort of ideas in the United States about weight loss. And there are significant people that we talk to that have tried, a semaglutide or tirzepatide, and they're like, hey, either it didn't do a darn thing, right? Like I'm missing something, or it just made me nauseous and didn't really help with my weight loss. But it very well may be this cortisol situation, right? And especially I look at it and I say, okay, how many women do I know that have had their hair on fire with excess stress for decades? Decades. I don't know of a particular time as an adult that I wouldn't have at least a 7 out of 10 on the stress scale. Either self-imposed because I take on a lot of things and I want to make things happen in my world, but a lot of it is stuff that's not within my control, but things I have to manage anyway. So that is really interesting. Now, the other thing that I found interesting in talking to this company is they were also looking at scans. So a lot of times, again, the excess cortisol is being made from a little benign tumor, right? So think of it as like a little nodule on the adrenal gland that is just overproducing cortisol. Well, what's interesting is when they started exploring these individuals, some of them had verifiable nodules, right? So on a scan, they showed up. Other ones, it was too small to be found at the time, but the lab values were positive for it. So what it means is also our visual screening that we use to identify adrenal nodules is not adequate to pick up maybe smaller nodules that are still overproducing cortisol, but they haven't gotten so big that they're obvious. And so when we start looking at these numbers of people, well over 30% in many cases fit that mold of excess body weight, cardiovascular disease, hypertension risk, and so if you've got 1,000 people, that's well over 300 people. It's 333. Let's call it 333 to 340. Let's call it what it is. That's a lot of people that are being told that they just need to work out more, they need to cut more calories. They lack the willpower, or they must be cheating somewhere, or something else is going on. Um, I've always been a huge, huge proponent for cortisol as this underlying concern. The problem is we didn't really have a way to identify it and get it diagnosed in your classic Western medicine, because endocrinology still use old data. And number two, what do you do about it? Right? So here's the crux of the matter. In some cases, it might make sense to have somebody go in and remove the nodule, right? In other cases, it may not. And the interesting thing here is the medication we were looking at is a medication that actually blocks the cortisol receptor. So this is where it gets interesting. So it doesn't necessarily shut down your ability to make cortisol. So if you were to look in the blood later on after starting the medication, the cortisol level in itself wouldn't necessarily come down because you're still producing it. But the drug actually goes in and blocks the cortisol receptor so it doesn't gain access, so it can't exert its behavior on those different tissues. So the interesting thing is it's we see the side effect of the drug, which is the reduction in cortisol impact, but not necessarily lower levels of cortisol. But what they did see in the individuals that were on this medication that were in the trial, they saw weight loss, they saw visceral fat loss, hypertension improvement, diabetes control improvement, right? So just by getting them treated appropriately with something to suppress the underlying activity, they were able to actually correct for what was wrong. Now, would I love to be able to say, this is all fine and dandy, maybe we can fix it with natural things, but sometimes blocking a receptor is the right way to go while we're doing all the other stuff, right? It still means that we need to work on our sleep and work on our psychological stress and take better care of ourselves and eat on a regular basis and all the things that we talk about all the time. But I do think, and I do know that, over 20 years, I have seen so many women that I'm like, I swear, I feel like your Cushing's that your cortisol is part of this picture, but then what do we do about it, right? What do we do about it? So, here's kind of the end result, right? Is we have to look at it and understand that endocrinology and general practitioners are not looking for a narrow range. They're looking for these extreme outliers on the bell curve. Either you're Addison's and you can't produce any cortisol, or you're 4 times normal, so you're producing so much that you have diagnosable Cushing's, when there's a good 24 to 30% that carry these other risk factors that are actually excess cortisol, hypercortisolism, that fall into this new category. And that we have a lot of people that fall into that category, and we need better screening and better utilization of newer medications. I'm a nutritionist. I don't prescribe. I have people that work with me that prescribe. And it's rare that I sit down in a pharmaceutical seminar and I'm actually super thrilled about what the medication does. This particular one, um, I was pretty excited about because of its impact on the metabolic effects of cortisol. And ultimately, what it does is it tells us that stress effects, cortisol effects on human body, and all of the related symptoms and related problems that happen actually are on a spectrum, and that our narrow examples and narrow requirements that we use to diagnose things are missing the point in a lot of people. And we have to acknowledge that cortisol exists on the spectrum, and that there's more about targeted treatment to balance cortisol than just doing stress management, improving sleep, getting exercise, and eating regularly. That we may very well have to do something to either reduce the production, which in some cases, if it's an adrenal nodule, remove it, or block the receptor so it doesn't have access so the body can get back to homeostasis with the other body systems. So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do about this? So number one, um, work with a functional practitioner that understands this. My experience has been that if you show up in an endocrinologist's office and ask to be looked at for Cushing's, if you don't fit the very narrow description of Cushing's for diagnostic criteria, you may not even get tested. That has been my experience for 20 years. I wish it was different, but conventional medicine isn't necessarily open. Now, if you can get your doctor or your practitioner to run a dexamethasone suppression test, which is the test, and it's a serum test that basically should identify if there's a significant overproduction. From there, there is the medication that can be used to treat it. And if it is a receptor issue, that medication will work really well. It's made by a company called Corcept Therapeutics, and it's an incredible medication. Now, if it's not that, you may have an adrenal nodule that is actually pumping out excess cortisol. And again, you're not going to feel that. You're not going to know. It's benign. It's not really causing direct pain or other problems. It just happens to be in the region where cortisol is produced. Now, could you have other things like excess DHEA and other androgens? Potentially, right? Depending on what's going on. So I think it's important to at least have a practitioner that can look at those things, your DHEA, your other adrenal hormones. I would still probably look at adrenal hormone metabolism, so urinary hormones as well. You could do a 24-hour urine or a spot test like a Dutch or HUMAP. But I also think the dexamethasone suppression test is required because that can identify that abnormal production. And then from there, having a practitioner that can help work with you to correct the underlying issue and possibly block that receptor. So I hope that you found this to be number one, fascinating, and number two, if you fall into this category, I hope this also gives you hope, because I know after 20 years and going through my own stress response, for me, cortisol was a big issue. And it was wrapped around my sleep and it was wrapped around airway. And it wasn't until I got some of those things fixed that a lot of my metabolic derangement started to repair. Getting my hormones balanced and all those other things helped, but there was definitely a stress level and cortisol level component that was tied very much for me to airway. And so, I feel vindicated because I've been screaming from the mountaintops for a long time that we're missing the mark on cortisol. And I'm very, very excited that we have some strong, credible clinical trials. These are placebo-controlled trials. So it's not using correlative data. It's solid research. And so I hope that this helps you at least have some more answers for maybe some of your own stress-related metabolic derangement and get you answers to get you to the next side and feel better. So I hope you found this to be a valuable episode of Menopause Mastery, and I'll be back with you next week. And if you loved this episode, please share it with a friend, because together we rise.